Now these mines, they're not something you step on and bang. No, they're tunnels dug underneath the German trenches, packed full of explosives. You dig them underneath the strong points of the German lines, and you blow them sky high to rearrange the geography of the battlefield. And they've dug 19 of these beneath German strong points. Now, as the 1st of July, the launch point of the Somme approaches, the German defences were believed to be smashed. And so, although the wire had, at the start of the barrage, been up to 40 feet deep in places, the British believe that they have succeeded in cutting it. However, we all know that that's not going to be the case. And on the 1st of July, you have the opening of the Battle of the Somme, the disastrous first day. What will go down in history as the single bloodiest day of the British Army. Now, the Goncourt diversionary attack fails in the north, as do the main British attacks in the northern part of the battle, along what we call the Albert-Bapaume road, although there are a few local successes. Now, south of that road, 15th Corps managed to take the village of Mametz, while 13th Corps, further south, to the east, achieve all of their objectives. And so the further north you are in the battle, the worse it is. But as you move towards the French part of the line, it becomes far more successful, and 13th Corps do make their objectives on the first day. The French attack on the first day, very successful. Now let's look at some case studies. And so the 36th Ulster Division, artillery fire aided by heavy French batteries, had been very effective. They then used Stokes mortars. They look like drain pipes in which you're chucking car exhausts, and they get launched at the enemy. Crude but effective Stokes mortars were used to fire smoke shells into the German lines. The infantry crawled into no man's land before the end of the barrage, breaking their orders, sheltering from the screaming British shells, and then won what they call the race to the parapet, shouting "no surrender," which confused the German troops because they normally attacking troops don't talk about surrender, but they meant no surrender to the Pope and to the Catholics in Ireland. And so shouting "no surrender," they charged towards the German lines, and they won the race to the parapet and got into the German Schwaben redoubt. But on the right, the 32nd Division had failed to take the key chateau of Thiepval that dominates the area around, leaving the flanks of the Ulster Regiment exposed to merciless German machine gun fire. German artillery then started to pound no man's land as the Ulstermen were fighting to clear the Schwaben redoubts, which meant that reserves couldn't come to help them. The men that had got into the German lines were on their own. On the left flank, the 29th Division had also failed. Now both flanks are exposed, with no man's land being swept by machine gun fire as these men fight to clear the trenches. The 107th Brigade is meant to go over the top to go and help the Ulstermen, but the Ulstermen's commander, a man called Nugent, thought it was unwise that with both flanks exposed that they wouldn't get through. He asked headquarters not to send the 107th men forwards, begged them not to go, but of course you don't have radios in this time period. You go over the top with men with telephone cables attached to their back, unwhirling them as they go over the top, so they can then put a field telephone in and try and talk to their own side. The German artillery fire had cut the wire that had been lent across, it's been laid across no man's land, and so runners had to be sent through this maelstrom of spinning metal to try and tell them not to go over the top. The message not to attack arrived at 9:16 a.m. The men had gone over the top at 9:15. It is a terrible slaughter. There's also, however, no way to tell the British artillery where the Ulstermen have actually got to. Now, the British artillery were timetabled to shell the Schwaben redoubt until 10 minutes past 10. They didn't know that the British troops had already got into the Schwaben redoubt, and so suddenly British troops are being hit not just by the Germans, but by the British artillery, and so a lot of them have to lie down in no man's land until the British artillery have finished working over that part of the front. Now, by the time the barrage had lifted, they still attacked. These men, the 107th, still stormed through shot and shell to try and take the German second line, and had even succeeded, in fact, in hitting that German second line. And with the point of the bayonet, they took it, and yet they were now so few that the Germans were able to counterattack and drive them back from the second line. The Ulstermen were eventually ejected that day from the Schwaben redoubt and made to stagger back through no man's land, back towards the British front lines, getting shot at all the way. And so the army had done all it could, but the army was inexperienced, fighting in its first major battle, and they had disastrously failed to change plans as the situation on the ground changed, and they had failed to reinforce success. There would be 60,000 British casualties, nearly 20,000 of them dead in the first day. So why was it such a disaster? Well, there was a lack of artillery, especially the necessary heavy guns. And the artillery was firing the wrong kind of shells. Britain had never needed so many shells for such a short period of time, and our industry was not geared up to making that number of shells. And so of the 1.5 million shells fired, 1 million of them were shrapnel instead of high explosive. Now, shrapnel shells are murder against troops in the open. A shrapnel shell fires down hundreds of little round lead balls that will be able to punch straight through a man. It will reduce advancing troops to mincemeat as they go across no man's land. But it won't cut wire. The barbed wire is made of steel. The balls are made of lead. It's like getting a pat of hot butter and throwing it at a knife, hoping to break the knife with the hot butter. So the soft lead, you can actually, if you walk the Somme, you walk across a carpet of these shrapnel balls, and if you see one with a V-shaped dent in it, that's where it hit the barbed wire. The shrapnel ball got damaged, and the wire was absolutely fine. And so they're firing the wrong kind of shells, and so men deep underground, they're not going to be harmed by shrapnel shells. They're not going to, and nor's the wire. And so of the 1.5 million shells, only the 500,000 high explosive shells are actually going to do any good. But if you walk the Somme, then you'll see an awful lot, even now, of unexploded shells. Be careful, don't pick them up. Many shells are duds. Around a third of the shells fired simply don't explode because British industry has had to gear up its production massively. Women have come in to industry to try and take the place of men, and they're doing a great job. They're working hard, they suffer extreme hardship, and a lot of them die in explosions from the industry. But it's true of everything. When you're doing something for the first time, you do it badly. And tragically, British industry is making shells on this scale for the first time, and it does it badly. And the artillery itself is badly used. The barrage is lifted from objective to objective, and so the British pound the front line, and then as soon as the men go over the top, they pound the second line, rather than creeping forwards, walking in front of the advancing infantry. And often the artillery gets too far ahead. Operating by timetable, often the British infantry are still fighting desperately for the front line, and yet now the British artillery have actually lifted and now starting to hit the third line, which is not doing any good. And the infantry have no ability to recall the artillery. They can't talk to the artillerymen and say, look, we've not stuck to timetable, we're falling behind. And they wouldn't be able to do so until 1917.